Nixon had ordered that Howard Hunt and the Cuban Americans be paid hush money to guarantee their silence. In return, they had pled guilty.
At the time, I never realized when you went to the Nixon White House you needed to be a criminal lawyer. I realize now it was essential in that presidency that you be a highly trained criminal lawyer. I never really had any question about my ability to handle the other legal problems, but I was not able to handle, my antenna wasn't even quivering about breaking the criminal laws.
But he was making sure the payoffs to the burglars happened, until Hunt started asking for more.
I'm really pulling out the statutes and reading some cases and trying to get a grip on what obstruction of justice is all about. And I know we're in trouble at that point. I know we're in a heap of trouble, and I try to convince my colleagues that we're in a heap of trouble. And they don't want to hear it. I remember Ehrlichman one day when I told him about obstruction of justice, he said, "Is there something putrid in your water out there where you live in Old Town?" He said he didn't want to hear it. But it wasn't a reality that could be ignored terribly long.
I think that there's no doubt about the seriousness of the problem we've got. We have a cancer close to the presidency that's growing.
I gave him a litany of problems, and every time I raised a problem, I was surprised by his reaction. I said, Bud Krogh thinks he has committed perjury during his confirmation hearing to be undersecretary. And Nixon's reaction is, well, John, perjury is a tough rap to prove. This is one you can beat.
Basically, it's because, one, we're being blackmailed. Two, people are going to start perjuring themselves very quickly that have not had to perjure themselves to protect other people and the like. And that is and there's no assurance that won't bust.
To tell him that the men who have been arrested are demanding more money, and it's going to go on and on and on. I tell him about the Howard Hunt demand.
The blackmail is continuing. Hunt now is demanding another $72,000 for his own personal expenses, another $50,000 to pay his attorney's fees, $120-some thousand. Hunt now has made a direct threat against Ehrlichman as a result of this. This is his blackmail. He says, I will bring John Ehrlichman down to his knees and put him in jail. I have done enough seamy things for he and Krogh that they'll never survive it. What's that on Ellsberg and apparently some other things. I don't know the full extent of it. It'll cost money. It's dangerous. The people around here are not pros at this sort of thing. This sort of thing mafia people can do. Washing money, getting clean money, and things like that. We just don't know about those things. We're not used, we're not criminals. We're not used to dealing.
And so Nixon finally says to me, John, he said, well, how much could it cost? And I picked out of thin air what I thought was a fairly, at that time, astronomical number. I said, well, it could cost $1 million.
On the money, if you need the money, you can get the money. Well, I think that what I mean is, you can get $1 million, and you can get it in cash. I know where it can be gotten. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not easy, but it can be done. But the question is, who the hell would handle it?
As the meeting goes on, I realize I haven't convinced Nixon that he's got to end the cover-up. In fact, I realize he's up to his eyeballs in this thing and knows more than I ever dreamed he knew. But I also knew that by doing what I had done, I had removed myself from being the desk officer of the cover-up, and that my days were numbered because I had in essence blown it up.
March 23rd. The Watergate burglars appear for sentencing. Presiding Judge John Sirica has made it clear he will show no leniency.
The cover-up plan was to have it end with Hunt and Liddy and present them as being wild men. It didn't go higher than them in the hierarchy, and McCord knew it did go higher. And suddenly when McCord, who had a family and was not a young man, he was in his 50s, realized he was going to go to jail, he then wrote the letter to Judge Sirica saying, I'd like to talk to you because this is not what it appears to be.
In the letter that Judge Sirica read aloud in the courtroom, McCord told what he knew. Political pressure, he said, had been applied on the burglars to keep silent. There had been perjury during the trial. and he would name names. One of them was John Dean. Another was Jeb Magruder.
Mitchell says, well, you need to hire an attorney. Just don't tell him the truth. So I go down and hire some good lawyers, and this one guy was very good. And one day he comes into my office and says, you know, Jeb, that's a great story you've told to the FBI, the prosecutors, the grand jury, and the trial. He said, you know much about perjury? And I said, well, you're not supposed to tell a lie under oath. He said, well, yes, but every time you tell one, it's a count. You know, it counts 5 years. So if any of what you've said is not true under oath, that's perjury. And every time you do it, it's another count. And oh, by the way, did you know that John Dean's down talking to the prosecutors? I said, what? I said, I can't believe that. He said, oh yeah, he's talking to the prosecutor. And guess who he is indicating has done this? And I said, well, who? He said, you. I said, what? So I go home that night, and I get the transcripts, and I start counting. I forget how many, but, you know, it was 40 or 80 or who knows how many counts of perjury. I multiply that by 5, and that's a long time. So the next day I go down and say, well, I guess we better talk.
The cover-up began to unravel.
The pressure was on me to lie. And I said, listen, despite what I've done to date, don't look to me to lie about anything. If I'm ever asked, I'm going to testify truthfully. And at that point, I was really trying to get everybody to understand the cover-up wasn't going to work. And everybody ought to start thinking about how we deal with the unraveling of it, but I wasn't selling it at that point. But if I had decided to lie, I'm convinced we would have pulled it off.
At the end of April, Nixon fired John Dean. He had been advised he should not stop there.
The argument that I had made to Nixon that he had to clean house was that for him to survive, given all what was happening in the spring of '73, he had to sort of make a complete break. And that meant that Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman had to go. I mean, these were persons for whom I had considerable admiration.
At Camp David, the presidential retreat 70 miles from Washington, Nixon talked privately to each of the men closest to him. The next day, he announced their resignations.
What he had said to each of them and what he repeated to me was that it was like having his arms giving, that it was the most terrible moment for him to confront what he was doing.
And on twilight of that day, April 30th, he was standing in the dark looking out the picture window at the mountains at Camp David, and Ron Ziegler came in behind him, and he was startled. He didn't realize anybody else was in the room. And he turned, he saw Ziegler, and he said, "It's all over, you know." And it's all over. And Ziegler didn't really respond, didn't know what to do. And Nixon walked outside, and as he was starting to walk outside, Ray Price, his chief speechwriter, came, saw the look on Nixon's face and on Ziegler's, and as Nixon walked around outside by the pool into the woods, he followed him because he thought Nixon was going to try to kill himself.
May 17th, 1973. A new chapter would open in the epic detective story that had begun with the loopy third-rate burglary 11 months earlier. By unanimous vote, the U.S. Senate had established a committee to investigate the presidential activities of 1972.
The committee will come to order.
It would become the most dramatic inquiry in the history of the nation, as Americans watched the hearings broadcast live.
This was a premier moment for Sam Erwin, for Howard Baker, for both Democrats and Republicans, because by then, even our friends who were